Workforce planning is about right people, right place at the right time. But how do we do that? Well, we're going to discuss it coming up right now. And here we are on the HR Hub podcast with me, Andrea Adams. Keep listening to learn about this and all kinds of things related to HR. You can also find me on YouTube. So today, my guest is Ross Sparkman. Ross is the Senior Director of Workforce Strategy at Walmart, and he's held similar roles at Nike and Meta. He's also releasing the second edition of his book, Strategic Workforce Planning, around the date that we're planning for this episode to come out. I think guru, when it comes to workforce planning, might sum him up nicely. And as a bonus, he's also from Calgary, which is where I live. Hi, Ross. How are you?
Good. How you doing, Andrea? Thanks for
Uh,
having me on the show.
yeah, well, thanks for coming on, fellow Calgarian.
Exactly. Go Flames.
This is going to be an intro discussion. So can we kick off it with what is workforce planning?
Yes, the age-old question, what is workforce planning? I think fundamentally, when we think about workforce planning, really it is about future-proofing the work or workforce readiness. And so what that really means is, from a both long-term and short-term perspective, it's about having the right people or employees with the right skills and capabilities, uh, working on the right things, in the right place, location, at the right cost. And, again, that's a little bit of a tall order. But essentially, what it means is that we want to be able to understand, what the workforce represents from a workforce distribution in terms of the right skills, the right levels, the right locations today, and then understanding where the workforce needs to be in the future for those same skills, location, and different variables. So it's really about understanding the workforce today, understanding what's needed for the workforce tomorrow, and then understanding what gaps need to be filled, what strategic actions need to take place to mitigate against some of those gaps.
Just as you were talking there, I was thinking, geez, is this a big organization thing? Like, at what size of organization does this become relevant?
The scale and the scope of how you approach workforce planning might change depending upon the size of your organization. But fundamentally, even if you're a smaller organization or a smaller company, even if you have 20 people in your organization, the fundamental requirements of understanding, the skills and capabilities and what those individuals are working on and what uh, that might look like in the future are still applicable. So you
Mhm.
might not have as much resources and you might not have the sophistication in terms of the processes and the technology and the tools and the data if you're a smaller organization. But fundamentally, the principles behind workforce planning, I think, still hold for smaller, medium, and larger organizations.
Okay. Do you want to talk to me about the principles? What are the principles?
Yeah, I think so. Principles, when I think about workforce planning, maybe we can even start by breaking it down a little bit further and talking about short-term workforce planning versus long-term workforce planning, or
Okay.
strategic workforce planning, and that way I can kind of dive in and tell you a little bit more about some of the
Okay.
principles. Or,
Okay. So let's start with short-term planning, and if you
okay.
yeah, include the principles while you're at it.
Typically, there's an annual process that happens in most organizations where they are going through the budget planning process, and the budget usually entails all the spending that you're going to do, which obviously includes your workforce and your wages, uh, and effectively allocates resources across different parts of the business, and again including your workforce and your hiring budget. So in short-term workforce planning, really the process and the role of workforce planning is to ensure that as the organization is going through this budgeting process, that you have a pretty good sense from the workforce standpoint where you're going to be allocating some of that budget and some of those resources across which teams. How much are you going to be growing or even potentially shrinking? What level and what will those cost, depending upon if it's a more senior role or more junior role. Again, the location, where are you going to be hiring? Is it just one office? Is it a global outfit that you have in terms of your organization? So there might be regional differences. You want to be able to understand, the sequencing and the timing of that hiring, right? So that you ensure that your talent acquisition function has enough time to prepare and actually go out and source the candidates. And you need to think about, what sort of experience level are we bringing in people that have a lot of experience, or is it going to be maybe more junior employees, which then starts to open up the door for more of the strategic workforce planning questions around, do we need to, if it is more junior resources, we need to think about how we're going to be training and developing them. Uh, are there elements that might impact generational preferences and for a more junior versus a senior workforce? So, really, it just comes down to thinking through what are the resources, where they need to be located, how much will they cost, how will we get them in the door in the right time to make sure that we're meeting the business requirements? And then as we start to think longer term, it becomes more strategic. And I could talk a little bit about this longer
Yeah.
term view and what that means.
Yeah. We'll get to the long term and the strategic. But as you were talking, there was like, well, okay, there's a ton of analysis going on,
Yeah,
but what's the cadence of this work? Like, are you doing it once a year? Or like, what does that look like?
that's a really good question. And I think that's actually one of the what I would call key distinguishing factors between doing good workforce planning or agile workforce planning and maybe more static or not as good at workforce planning.
Okay.
The way that it should work is you kinda go through this pre-planning process or this kind of budget planning process. Maybe that takes 3 months. Workforce planning and HR should be really involved in that. But once the plan is set and the budget has been defined and everybody sort of signs off on it, whether it's the board or your C-suite, then it really becomes a matter of what I would call a monthly cadence at the minimum.
Mhm.
And in this monthly cadence, maybe it's an hour meeting where you would have maybe your whoever's leading driving your workforce planning efforts. You would want your sort of HR business partner, your talent partner, whether it's TA or somebody else from talent, a finance leader, obviously, and then the business leader. And the idea would basically be coming out of that budget process, you would have like an annual workforce plan. And that plan might say that you're hiring X number of employees in X location at X cost. You want to be able to do that every month, track how you're progressing against that initial plan. And that's where I think some organizations don't develop the tactical or the process rigor to be able to do that. But you want to come in every month with data, say how do we track, how are we tracking against the plan, whether it's growing or shrinking or staying the same. Where have we seen attrition? Where are we having issues hiring? Have there been additional needs based on the business and where we're going that might necessitate more resource requirements and more hiring? And you want to be able to do that every month and keep the business in the loop.
Could ask a million questions about that. Maybe I won't for quite yet. What are the steps of strategic or long term workforce planning?
Yeah. So, and this is a really interesting one. I would say that this is an area that more organizations don't have clearly defined processes and steps in place, but it's in a sense similar to short term or operational workforce planning, but the time horizon or the time period is just longer. I would say usually strategic is between 1 to 5 years, and typically most organizations, in addition to doing their short term planning, that year long 12-month budgeted planning, they also do what has been called long range planning (LRP) in most of the organizations that I worked at. And in the LRP, it's similar to the short term, but now the organization is thinking more big strategic plays that they're going to make, right? So maybe that they're going to expand their operations in some region in the world, or they have some big capital expenditure, big project coming down the pipelines in the next 2 to 3 years. Strategic workforce planning would say, okay, now based on this new strategy or this sort of big project that we have going on, what might the resources and the workforce requirements be to make sure that we are able to support those big projects or those big investments or changes in the workforce. And it would be similar to the short term operational workforce plan in terms of you would actually create a 3 to 5 year plan. Uh, and it's going to be a little bit more directional. Obviously, there's going to be more forecasting. There's going to be more scenarios, but you want to have a 3 to 5 year plan of how you will, from a resource HR employee perspective, meet that uh, strategic plan that the organization has.
When you are doing strategic workforce planning, let's say I'm just thinking about one of my clients and they anticipate like almost 50% growth. Um,
Wow, yeah, that's a lot.
it's a lot, but they're a small organization, so it's not a big people count. We're all subject to the whims of the market and, government decisions and whatever. Where does that fit?
No, that's a really good question. I think it's also a really good example of what good workforce planning or strategic workforce planning looks like. And so the way that I would frame this, and this is a good moment in time, just with everything that's going on with different parts of different workforces around the world and AI. When you're going through that budgeting process, it's really important to take a, and when I say it's important, I'm talking about really HR and the workforce planning function. It's important to take a 30,000 foot view and to really, I think almost, I don't want to say skeptically, but think strategically about the resources that are being asked by the business and
Hmm.
and run some different scenarios to say, okay, based on the skills and the talent that you're requiring for the business, how are we thinking about some of the risks that might be involved if we
Hmm.
overhire? If changes are going to happen in the workforce, and maybe there's 2 or 3 different scenarios that we run
Hmm.
in terms of how we achieve that growth um, responsibly. Because in my experience, a lot of leaders uh, are typically have a little bit of a blinders on or
Yeah,
thinking is
yeah.
to build their teams,
Right.
right? They have a remit to do something for the business, and they're not necessarily always thinking about who's getting what for the resources or what it might cost. They just want the resources to do the job that they've been tasked to do as a team, and everybody feels like their work is the highest priority. And so it is a little bit of a workforce planning kind of coming in and outlining some criteria that you might want to think about, doing some different scenarios, ensuring that we have considered all the risks and the potential implications if we don't. Now, I'll say, Andrea, that in my experience, that's something a lot of organizations don't do very well. And I'll use my example when I was in tech, when I was at Meta. We were in a hyper growth phase. Also, we were at 30% year over year. We grew from 5,000 to 50,000 when I was there. And every single year, I'm thinking to myself as the workforce planning, like, we are growing way too much. This isn't sustainable. If you look back now to Meta over the last 2 or 3 years, you know, there's been a huge sort of pullback. And obviously, leaders were not thinking strategically enough over the last 5 or 10 years around how much they should grow. So there's always going to be that resistance, and I think that's just the inherent part of the role, is to think more critically and to ensure that at least at the minimum you've raised the red flag to leaders around where there could be potential risks.
Yeah. When you think about risks, how do there's also the risk that you don't hire enough people and then you can't grow and there's missed
Yeah,
opportunities.
exactly. Yeah.
You've got like risks coming in from like pretty much 360. How do you boil that down into decision making?
So there's a couple things. So first of all, one of the things that is a big part, and this is when you start to get into more strategic workforce planning. Some organizations do it, some don't. It's called workforce segmentation, and basically the idea is, and this is another sort of cross-functional activity that workforce planning should be doing with the business and HR, but it's basically workforce segmentation is to basically look across all of the roles in the workforce and then try to segment those roles into different categories. And so the way that we think about it in lives in at Walmart and in past lives is in the technology function, we would have kind of 3 categories. We would call your developers or your software engineers builders.
Yeah.
That's really the crux of where the work is happening. Like, absolutely have to have those, you know, then that skill, those employees and that skills in those roles to be able to execute on your strategy. Then you have called the enablers for software engineers. you need product managers and project managers. They can't do anything unless you have somebody that's really outlining the requirements for what they're building, and
Okay,
then
yeah.
actually manage the project. So we would call those enablers, and then everybody else we would call operators. So your supporting function, it would sort of be your true overhead costs. So the parts of the business that are not necessarily growing revenue, or I don't want to say adding value because that's not necessarily the case. We need the supporting roles and function, but they are more pure overhead. And so if you start to break out, as again as an example of how you can start to prioritize the workforce into these three segments, and again I'm talking about tech, you can now start to say, okay, well, based on our strategic direction the business is going, based on the fact that we know that there's risks out there, where would we want to, or how much of our total investments should we be looking at across these three different segments, and starting to use that as guidelines for really making more strategic decisions. If we needed to kind of pull back, which of these three groups could we do that, for, and not necessarily put the business at risk for not having the right talent. Again, it's a very difficult exercise to do from a change management perspective because everybody thinks that their work again is the most important, and everybody thinks that they're builders. And so when I in my past and the way that we do this sort of activity is it really is it's a senior level sort of exercise that you want to be having with your top leaders, and even then, there's going to be sometimes disagreements around who's kind of critical roles or who's not. But it really should be something that you're working with the top leaders against, really getting priorities across and ensuring that there's a clear understanding what those risks are, and why uh, the business would want to invest in certain areas at certain times and not. So that's one potential, you know, approach to kind of thinking about this. Another is um, also thinking about how you might use contingent workforce. And again, once you start to understand the business and have a really good sense for what parts of the business fluctuate. Again, and I'll use an HR example. If you're in high growth mode, you're going to need more recruiters naturally to hire the people coming in the door. If we think that there's going to be a world where something happens unexpectedly and we don't have to hire as much, recruiters sometimes, unfortunately, are a group that gets impacted. And so when you're thinking about planning for the future workforce, is there a world where maybe you have a certain percentage of your recruiters that are contractors, so
Mm.
that gives you flexibility when there's a slowdown, to where you don't have to necessarily let go and have a big sort of you know downsizing moment. So
Mhm.
there's things like that. Again, when you're going through that planning process, when you're thinking strategically, having those different scenarios, thinking about the risks and the growth, all through the lens of meeting the business objectives, if that makes sense.
As I introduced the topic, we talk about right skills at the right time in the right place. That covers so much of HR. It's recruitment, it's training, it's I don't know, like it's everything
Pretty
really.
much, yeah.
How do we make sure that workforce planning is integrated into other HR work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, in my mind, the first step is really building it out as part of the HR operating model. And I think
Hmm.
right, like when you're thinking about all the key milestones and the actual ebbs and flows of the business and how HR supports that, workforce planning should be part of that. And I think the good news here is that a lot HR should really be thinking of workforce planning as a supporting function for the rest of HR, right? And I'll use a couple examples here. Let's say that you are in onboarding, right? And you're trying to plan some onboarding classes or your onboarding content for the next fiscal year. And it's next fiscal year is 2 months around the corner. Well, you need to know how many people you're going to be hiring, and you need to know where they're going to be hiring them, what level they're going to be hiring them, et cetera. So that right off the bat is something that the workforce planning team or the workforce planning should be providing, that onboarding. Similarly, if we think about L&D or talent management, we know that maybe there's an organization that has a certain number of manager training or specific areas of training that are either mandatory they want to provide to the organization. the question becomes then, well, how much training will be provided? If it's in classroom, how do we plan for that? Again, if we think about workforce planning, we could say, well, there's going to be this many people that are going to be being promoted into manager roles. We think that attrition is going to be this much, and you might lose some. And so it helps also give that function in HR ability to understand. Okay, well, you know, we might be increasing our managers in this part of the workforce, so we need to be ready in terms of the training. Um, Also, on that same vein, there again through that strategic workforce plan, where we start to identify where there might be gaps in the skills that we need to develop to meet our strategy. We could work with the L&D workforce plan and say, okay, well, that we know that there's a gap here. Where do we see more gaps in the workforce from a skills perspective? And maybe and we'll use a really good salient example right now. It could be just in Gen AI prompt engineering. There's
Hmm.
probably gonna be certain groups uh, across the business that need to be developing that skill set, right? Again, thinking through the future, if L&D and talent are working directly with this workforce planning team, they'll have insight into knowing like, oh, well, yeah, 2 years from now, that could be something that's really, really important for our workforce. We should start thinking about how we are going to prepare workforce through our training and development to be able to do that. So I think two poles, building that rigor around actually making workforce planning part of the process, and then ensuring that there's communication and visibility, and that your HR leaders know to leverage workforce planning to help them do their jobs. I think then it starts to connect those dots.
How has workforce planning changed while you've been doing it? And what do you anticipate?
In certain areas, it's changed. In certain areas, it hasn't changed. I think there's definitely a more awareness of sort of workforce planning than there used to be. I know it's still not necessarily a super well understood part of the business, and some organizations don't do it. But I think it's started to get a little bit more traction and
Hmm.
visibility than it used to have. I think the biggest thing though is just the use of data, and fundamentally, data is a really big part of workforce planning.
Yes.
To be able to understand the current workforce and then the future, you do that through your data to a large extent, and obviously working with leaders and HR business partners. But I'd say the data that we are getting now, and the systems and the technology that we have available at our fingertips to analyze that data and to do better forecasting
Mm.
and to share that data. Again, it depends on the organization, but I've seen generally that's probably a little bit better than it has been in the past. So that's one thing that's it's definitely improved. Um, I think what hasn't necessarily improved is I still think that there are certain mindset shifts that have to happen. That some, and this is again, I think a leader thing we talked about a little bit. Leaders still are usually typically motivated to just kind of build out their teams and have blinders on, and are not necessarily thinking about the rest of the organization. I think that they're to get ahead of that. I think that there needs to be even more executive sponsorship, all the way up to like the CEO level, CPO level, to ensure that leaders understand the importance of doing good workforce planning, and the potential to mitigate against future risks, and to
Hmm.
really take advantage of opportunities. So there's a change management, and almost maybe uh, holding leaders more accountable to doing good workforce planning than I think has happened in the past. So that's
Hmm.
something that's going to be more of an opportunity. I think as we move into the future, and where some things might be changing, and how some of that accountability might be changing from a workforce planning perspective. I do think that AI is one of the areas that stands to impact the way workforce planning is done. But also, as we think about how leaders are going to be um, think not, I won't say forced, but probably put in position to be held more accountable for how they think about their workforce, is something that could happen in the future, right? Where if if AI has the potential to take 30% of the tasks that any particular role does, leaders are going to have to think about how they get the most efficiency out of AI, and should they be hiring as many, or should they be creating new roles? And I think that your CEOs of the world are going to start holding their leaders more accountable to be able to do that. They don't want to build out a big workforce if they're going to have to shave it down or shift folks around. And I think
Yeah.
it's a really critical moment in time that that's going to start to happen.
I
And so,
I've been thinking about that a lot,
yeah,
a lot. So this conversation is timely, and the next one we're going to have
we go
is
really deep in
also
this. Yeah,
the next conversation you and I are going to have is also timely. Um, we're getting to the end of this. I can hardly think of another episode where I would recommend someone read the book more highly.
yes, that's a
So, can you
great.
tell us a bit about your
Sure.
book and where people can find you?
Yeah. So if you are kind of enjoying kind of what we're discussing here and you want to learn a lot more about it, uh, I've essentially written two books. I had a first edition that I wrote back in 2017, and I've spent the better part of the last 2 years refreshing that book, and it goes really deep into all of this. We talk about operational workforce planning and the processes and the tools and the technology and how to handle the data, how you interact with the different parts of the business, the roles and responsibilities. We talk about longer term, more strategic workforce planning, what that means for talent management. How do we do early career planning versus succession planning? We talk about remote work. How do we do workforce planning for remote work? We go deep into discussing exactly what we kind of just talked about here, Andrea, and is like, how do we do workforce planning for a world that is where the workforce and the way that we work is going to start to dramatically shift, meaning we're going to be working with AI as part of the workforce. How do we plan for that? What's HR's role in that world? Um, and so, short answer here is that the book's got a lot of really good content around, you know, HR being more strategic and what strategic workforce planning is. So it'll be available next month, Amazon and Kogan Page.
Yes, April 17th. I looked it
April
up.
17th. You got it. There you go. I knew it was the middle of the month, but I wasn't sure the exact date, so Andrea just actually helped me.
Yeah.
And you can find me obviously on LinkedIn, and connect with me. I love talking about this stuff and, helping leaders and individuals and anybody that's really interested in the topic think through some of the things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for all. That was amazing. And I am looking forward to reading your book because it's just so important right now. We have reached the end of this episode, though. Thanks for listening out there, and we'll catch you next time when I talk with another amazing guest.